and brown queers give away their music to cis straight women, both black and white, who continue to profit, don't care. I continue to question if these tracks and sampling are just queer product placement. Are they liberatory or the master's ploy at stealing our land, resources, and then selling it back to us tenfold? Or is it love and adoration? Or is the love and adoration held for these women a manufactured brand loyalty? All right. I think this is the last one I'm going to read. I keep saying that, but I get all excited. I'm like, maybe two more. Okay. A year ago, I was triggered by the announcement of this new and last Daniel Craig James Bond film, triggered that they announced a new black lesbian 007. I was both excited and triggered, which was unprecedented and long overdue, and at least 30 years before I had said to a lover, also a black lesbian, I want to play a black lesbian action figure, a detective, an agent. 30 years ago, my dream was implausible. Lesbians of any kind had to be closeted. It angered me now that Hollywood has stolen a dream of mine, which had me tumbling down halls of all the LGBTQI creatives who'd been sidelined and silenced, whose ideas were like stolen treasures looted from Africa and the Caribbean, or co-opted by straights, or told they were sick and way ahead of their time. I want to write a requiem for queer dreams, that massive grave where so many hopes and aspirations and desires and earnings and allowances were buried. This now is in no way an analogy, but as an aside today, an Indigenous student from Canada, when I asked about the graves they're finding of Indigenous children, he said the number is up to 5,000. He said sometimes the priests would get the Indigenous girls pregnant and discard the babies, which is pure horror and evil. Also forced into government housing, not allowed to own their own property. Another student from Cambodia whose parents survived Pol Pot and the treacherous aftermath, books, libraries, learning destroyed, artists killed. Now imagine a graveyard for every gay and lesbian person through America's 400-year history, marked and crucified and killed. Then I start thinking about what was previously unthinkable. People now starting to talk reparations for Black Americans impacted generationally by slavery and segregation. And sometimes I teach Sekou's lyric poem, "Come on and bring on the reparations." Instead of enjoying glorious freedom, we're dumped into a fragile economy with no earnings and no health care, no 40 acres, no mule. And while we're at it, I want this to serve as a letter, a law, amendment, whatever, providing restitutions for queers. For families and friends of loved ones who died and were injured by the hands of homophobes. I want reparations for their lovers, friends, and families, anyone impacted by corrective rape, shock therapy, and conversion, injured within the medical system, all those queer children bullied on playgrounds who drank and drugged themselves to death because they couldn't face it. I want a check for every time some queer kid had to lie about who they were ostracized and thrown out of families. $1 for every queer LGBTQIA runaway for those who didn't make it. All the love actualized, surrendered, those forced to live in invisible cells, real and imagined, but whose body, like mine, like slaves, has head-to-toe scars, hands, minds, wrists. I want money for all the queer creatives never allowed to see themselves in museums or galleries, on television, on TV, bookshelves, all that lost income when discovered at work, all the relationships destroyed, millions for every holiday spent alone, because as Christo said, it's hard to love oneself in a culture that thinks that you're a disease. Alone, forced separations, those that saw their partners die from cancer and AIDS and weren't allowed to attend or visit the funeral, who lost their homes and their lifetime leases because queer partnerships weren't recognized. I want millions, trillions for every sneer, every jab, those who got uninvited, compensation for every doctor and policeman that touched us with rubber gloves. I want it all. Dollars for every tear shed added up would be trillions. Those bodies of all the queers tossed away without rights and rights, uninterred and buried again with dignity. I want holidays named and markers given. I want history and herstory and non-binary books filled with our contributions for athletes and scientists and models and dancers and singers and doctors and nurses and artists. And for queers of color, I want extra, I want more. I want every main street in America and every town renamed Lesbian Way with Pat Parker, Audre Lorde, June Jordan, and Pamela Sneed. Sorry. Thanks. Thanks. Thank you. Well, there's one more that I want to do. Yeah, we have time. Even though the murderous cop Derek Chauvin is on trial for the murder of George Floyd, and the cops who killed Breonna Taylor watch free, the world is a mess fighting COVID-19 amongst other pressing issues. I want to divert here from human rights topics, which my student actually says are human wrongs. Instead, I want to use my paper, my pen, my phone as tools, as vehicles to praise artists. I discovered through some research, praise poems vary from the Yoruba and the Zulu tribes onward, but the main point is to pay tribute. And this praise poem that I'm shaping is for all the artists, considered small and insignificant by some, but like doctors and nurses and frontline workers who, in my opinion, have lifted and lift some of the heaviest burdens of this pandemic. Black, brown people, women, and millions of documented and undocumented workers from factories to farms whose work is underappreciated, unseen, expected for bare minimum or free. Like those brown hands that pick fruit from thorny branches in 100-degree temperatures so you can enjoy supermarket produce, or tiny brown hands harvesting cocoa, women in factory jobs stitching textiles. Today, this poem says, I see you. I want to thank all the artists who carried and carry us through the uncertainty of this pandemic, whose music and art lifted spirits, artists who offered online classes, reworked syllabi, created lesson plans to fit into tiny computer screens for all their craft and voices to help people regain equilibrium and purpose, who even in drought and times of catastrophe offered seeds, planted a way, a path forward, used leftovers like wood, wire, plastic to build vessels like guides and shamans and mystics who offered runaway slaves meals, routes, clothing, and inspiration. I want to thank all the artists pitching in to save institutions that were actually constructed and meant to save us. Artists giving away work fitting for museums at little or no cost, donating time, services, art, and poetry when old ways crumbled and no one knew what to do. I want to thank all the artists without enough for themselves, but like mothers setting a table for friends and neighbors and children still give. Artists who know that there is more to healing the body than medicine alone. Those who know that music, art, poetry, dance are just as essential as doctors, nurses, and other people in healthcare, like food delivery workers who provide sustenance. Without it, without artists, we could not thrive. Thank you. 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 Yeah, didn't do. Now we can chat.
If you have a question, just raise your hand and they'll bring you a microphone. I can know. Here. Go ahead.
Oh, I don't have a question.
Oh,
I'm
okay,
just
I'll-
passing the mic.
I'll ask a question just to warm things up. So I had read your poems, but I'd never heard you read them. And I had a particular, like a question, it's kind of a technical question, I guess, but the kind of, the lines where you end and you slow down and I thought of as like levitating, like you sort of levitate over the last few words or the kind of the punchline or the ender. Could you talk a little bit about that, like how you started doing that, where it comes from, what you feel like it does?
I don't know. That's difficult because it's like, I mean, it's like years and years and years of performance, right? And so sometimes, like I can be rushing through, like I'm aware of like, maybe rushing through like some images or rushing through the text. And so then like there are those moments of like remembering to like stop, slow down, like kind of pause, right? And then, I'm thinking about it as music, like what you're going to highlight and what you're not going to highlight, you know what I mean? What's important, what's not important, And each time you read it, it may be different, you know what I'm saying? Like sometimes I was like looking at some of this text tonight and like certain words stood out to me that haven't stood out to me in the past, right? So I might punch that up, So it's really, it's really like performance style, like, trying to figure out where the work is going to land or where you want to land it, where you want to give people a moment to kind of, feel it or listen to it or, yeah. Yeah, so like, at this particular point, it's probably like unconscious, you know what I'm saying? Because I've been working at it so long, so it's just sort of like, and there's the written word and then, also I'm a performer, so it's just kind of like, I want the work to come alive, and it's like, how do you make it alive, right? That's what a performer has to do. Lots of work, lots of training.
Thank you.
How'd it go?
Oh, is it me? Oh, thank you, Pamela. As always, amazing.
Thank you.
I want to hear more about this sculpture and maybe connections to the poetry and just, I know your trajectory. It's involved, everything from watercolor to neon to, in terms of your visual work. Just a little more about becoming a sculptor. You already are, but.
Well, okay, so my visual practice is like probably about 7 or 8 years old. My painting and drawing is probably maybe 6 years old. But I was always immersed in visual art. Like, all my friends were visual artists. I sort of like came up with like Julie Moretu and Paul Pfeiffer and all of them. And, I was good friends with like their gallerist and, so this was like back in the day. So all my friends were visual artists and I collected, right? So like all over my house, like people would be like, oh my God, Pamela, this is just beautiful, And in terms of theater, like I could make really beautiful things on stage and stuff like that, but I didn't, what's happening? All right. But about 13 years ago, can people hear me? I did an MFA in New Media Art and Performance, and after that, I was like, oh, I want to start making things with my hands. And then somebody like who's standing by me was like, finally, like I got it, you know what I'm saying? And then somebody said to me, oh, you were repressed, right? I was like, okay, you know what I mean? So I guess like that I had like repressed it or something like that. And then, so once I got that instinct and, what I've been talking to people about in terms of studio visits and more, it's all about listening to that instinct. It's all about following like, one's gut, right? And like it won't lead you wrong, you know what I mean? And so if I feel it in my gut, I mean, that's like years and years of being a poet has taught me, right? You know, it was like listening, listening, listening. So then it was like, oh, okay, I got to start making things. And then, like, maybe about 7 years ago, I had like a really fancy health insurance, and they paid for any kind of therapy, and like I'm a big therapy person. And so then I was like, I want to take art therapy, you know? And then I started taking art therapy, and I was like, oh no, like I started in a group. And I realized that like, oh, this is like poetry, like I have to do it. Like it's not a hobby. You know what I mean? Like I need it to like kind of survive. I need it to breathe. And then I just started like learning. I mean, and it was interesting because I was also teaching in visual programs, right? And so, you know, I always had the language. I mean, I was like, you know, visual artists always spoke to me, so I knew a lot about visual culture anyway. And it was funny because like I was invited as a critic to Columbia one night, and then they said, and by then I was just talking about like poetry and stuff like that, but people really liked, you know, how I was talking and stuff like that. And they said, well, who would you most like to have come back? And they said, Pamela. And I was like, you know, so I was like a poet, you know, like a poet in the program. And then, you know, and more just like making and making and making. And it like sort of brings me joy. And I don't know, like in terms of the sculptures, like I was thinking about, somebody took this picture of me at the Armory when I was playing Big Mama Thornton, and I was like singing my heart out. I didn't sing, no one asked me to sing today, so it's good, don't. Okay. So anyway, and I was thinking, and I had this show coming up, you know, at Kate's Ferries, and I wanted to do all the blues singers, but, and then I was thinking, when I saw that picture, I was like, oh, shit, you know, I should do a collage or, you know, something like that. And then I was in Minneapolis or whatever, and I saw in like a thrift shop, like one of those like paper doll kind of things, and like they had and I was like, that's what I want to do, that's what I want to do. And I think that, I mean, years ago somebody said to me, because I was working really small, and they said, Pamela, like, you know, like you're big, like, and I mean, if you come to my house, like there's like huge sculptures, you know, they're my size, right? And so it's kind of like my vision. So I think more and more that my vision, like that I get comfortable and that I'm learning, like I just start like building things, right? So this was the first time that I was like, oh, okay, I want to make these like, you know, these sculptures. And then again, I'm like trying to assert myself into this lineage, right? So it's kind of like, it's personal, it's political, right? So I have the blues singers and then me as the blues singer. So trying to kind of create these histories and stuff like that. And then, yeah, and like, I had something at the Ford Foundation, I guess, last year, and basically I did a neon. I mean, they paid for it. They have a lot of money, right? But anyway, you know, so I was like, you know, oh, like, what about a neon? And they were like, yeah, sure, you know, draw it up. And I was like, oh, right, yeah, right. So I was trying to, what was I trying to do? Like, kind of create more of an overlap between my poetry and, you know, and my visual work, right? So my gallerist didn't really like it, but everybody else did, right? And so I have this idea that I want to do like a room of haikus, you know, and I think haikus are so beautiful, you know? So anyway, so other people who weren't like, who don't want to sort of like, you know, contain me to this, you know, encourage that. But more and more, I'm trying to create like the overlap between my poetry, so I wrote this piece about Big Mama Thornton. I did a lot of like research, and then and I did it all on my own. I didn't really have like a lot of funding. It started with a commission from Denniston Hill, and then it was like postponed like through the pandemic. Then I was working with my music teacher, Barbara May Augustern, who Miguel also works with, and she was killed, and it was like really horrible. And so the show kept being postponed. And then, but by the time, you know, the pandemic has like waned and all of that, like I was ready. By the time we got to like the Armory, I was like, oh yeah, I'm Big Mama Thornton. You know, people were like, okay, you know. So yeah, so then I want like the painting to kind of like, you know, replicate that, right? And so like, again, like there are places you're going to go to a gallery, you're not going to see all these queer black women, right? Like, so it's June, it's like, gay pride and all that stuff. And so I wanted there to be a place that people would go and there would be queer black legacies, right? Legacies. And then also like Funeral Diva is a lot about me coming through the AIDS crisis and like losing a lot of black gay poets. And so basically I started rendering them in watercolor. And I didn't show some of that work tonight, but that's like in a show with visual aids right now. And that was at the Ford Foundation last year. And so it's like Donald Woods and Essex Hemphill. And I think I sent you guys Asado Saint. His book is coming out. So it's like it's being republished. And he was like a really important central figure, in the early 90s and like really like a leader. And so I wrote the foreword to his book. And I've been rendering him in watercolor. And then it was really funny because like at this show at Visual Aids, like at EFA Project Space, I realized that like a lot of people don't even know who these guys are. Like there was like one of like Craig Harris, but then somebody from like back in the day came and they were hugging me and they were like crying and they were like thank you, for like remembering. So I always want to try to, and also last year I had the people from Tops that were murdered like in that supermarket, right? And so I always want people like who basically, you're not gonna go to a New York gallery and see, you know what I'm saying? In the David Peterson Gallery in Minneapolis, I did a wall of Masa Amini, and that was like the girl that was like killed in Iran, and like that kind of like sparked the revolution, which I thought was like so incredibly important. And like I was trying to have a conversation with a lot of my students, and they were just like, and I was like, isn't it powerful? Isn't it profound? And they were like, So I started like documenting, and because I want like people to be recognized. I want these movements to be recognized. I want them to be seen. I want them to be. I mean, even talking about like the Capitol rioters. Like last year, 2 years ago, I did a chapbook if the Capitol rioters had been black. And I felt like that was such a silenced, like everybody, the government, everyone participated in basically silencing that whole thing and like burying it. And I just thought, oh my God, like we have to say something, we have to do something. And so like the zine was really like my attempt to kind of keep it in, conversation, keep it in rotation. Like this is something like incredibly horrible and important that happened in America, and we need to fight back. You know what I mean? So it's like, yeah, thinking about like words as a resistance, and also thinking about like the artists like documenting and responding and mobilizing people. Do you know what I mean? So that's sort of like my commitment. But yeah, more and more and more. And I was saying, like, in the beginning, I was really, like, in terms of visual art, like, I was really interested in abstraction, and then I was interested in portraiture. And, like, for a long time, like, they were separate, and I couldn't bring them together. And now, it's just sort of, like, through the watercolors and everything, like, letting them drip and the wet on wet and everything, now they've gotten abstract. So it's like, it takes time, but to fuse them all together, or even like I've always written about Tina Turner and then her passing, and then I did this piece on her, and I'm like using my text and also her text. So more and more and more of those relationships are coming together. But it's something that like you have to work on. In the beginning, people were like, oh, you're a text-based artist. You're not new. You're text-based. And I was like, no. And I just didn't want to be in a box, like I really, and I think for like, a black queer person, like, everybody always expects me to like come in and, move the mountain and all this other stuff. And I just kind of like wanted to like contemplate ducks, like water, like landscape. So for me, it was respite, in the beginning, And I feel like that's a place, there's like the Black Power naps, right? The NAP ministry and all that, like, so that respite is also important to people of color, and that's part of the revolution too, taking care of ourselves. And so in a way, I had to kind of come to the marriage of everything very slowly, like, so now it's like I'm coming on my own terms and I'm bringing text and stuff like that. But like, I didn't want to be forced into it, As a long answer. Denengang. Another treasure we have here.
Hi. So you wear a lot of hats. I'm right here. It's Bianca. Hi. So you wear a lot of hats, and I'm just kind of curious if you can talk a little bit about how they all feed into each other, like how being an educator feeds into your art, and how being a writer feeds into your paintings and your sculptures, and just kind of how it all bounces off of each other. And yeah.
Well, I teach a writing class, and like a lot of things that people say things to me. People, I read things that basically mean something. Like my students will tell me about like their struggles or their different things. Like I said, and the one about No Time to Die, right? That like, one of my Native American students, well, actually not Native American, but Indigenous from Canada, was talking about like what was happening, like finding like those graveyards of like Native, children and stuff like that. And like, they're telling me this, and like that's impactful, right? Or, and so when I'm like, so when people were talking to me, it's going into like my stories, or it will trigger my stories, or something that I'm thinking about, or if I ask, people to think about like abolition or whatever, then it's like, well, how do I think about abolition, right? So I don't know. I mean, it's not really linear, but like everything does just kind of like cross-pollinate, It's just, it just is that way, just like staying open and not really shutting it down, Like when I started writing about like the movies and stuff, and I did a big thing on, actually in America Ain't Ready, there was a big thing on Xena. Right, and like that was like a leap, because I like do this whole interpretation of like Xena, right, and like somebody said, well, I'm glad you like kind of like allowed yourself to go there, and it's like paying attention to those instincts and to those things that like, because a lot of times we have like these like walls, well, this happens here, and then this happens here, and then this happens over here, right? But when you allow all those things, like when you don't set up the like rules, so if in fact you're like, doing your serious writing during the day, but like you're watching, The Flash or something, or Bridgerton, like I have a piece about Bridgerton right in my head, right? But basically, like that goes into it, you know what I'm saying? So not creating that kind of like fragmentation, or if you go see, when Geishimuto at the like, the new museum, and something about that like really grabs you and touches you, then that's part of your life, and that's something that you carry on in some other way, you know what I mean? So I think the most important thing is like not to set up rules, to like listen to everything, that's happening. If you're in a conversation with your friend and like you giggle and you cry together, then that's the stuff of your art, right? So not just not creating faction, you never want that. And so then things start to like feed over, and it's like, oh, can I, again, like I was just reading about like some visual artists who had something at botanical gardens and like made all these sculptures and stuff like that. So you have to like have a sense of freedom and not creating like a lot of like walls in art, just allowing things to feed, and not again, not shutting down the instincts, and not shutting down the emotion. Like if something brings you joy, bring it into the work. If something makes you really sad, bring it into the work. If something makes you angry, like all of those things, right? So you're not like here to like, separate. Like I think that was that's early education, right? They're like, oh, there's a difference between this and then that, and then you have all these people in America that are all like factionalized, right? But really, like we're a whole self, and so then we need to like work from that. That's my lesson. I'm sticking to it. Yeah.
Hey, how's it going? So I got a question for you. I can see that there's passion and the works that you speak about. Now, for people of color, there are certain topics that they may be emotional or sensitive to talk about. When you're going through your creative process, how do you filter through your wordplay? Let's say there's a topic that's very touchy, emotional, heavy. Is there a spectrum for you where it's like, okay, this is what I want to say, and then there's that other half of the coin where it's like, that's a little too much? Or are there no boundaries for your work?
Well, I think about like writing, I think about art as like a breaking of silences, right? And so if your priority, like for me, you know, I kind of come from like the Audre Lorde school, you know, where you want to break silence, right? You want to come to voice in whatever way that means. And so I feel like once you break one silence, it kind of frees you maybe to break the next one and the next one. Like, but life is a process of kind of like breaking those silences. If that's like what the priority is for you, like that's the priority for me. Of like you guys brought up Simone's book, and there was something that I went through in terms of like, you know, fibroids and doctors, and like I went through hell with the system. And I haven't really written about that, you know, and it was like the first time writing that particular introduction that I started like talking about it, right? And so, like each time I'm asking myself, are you ready to talk about this? Do you want to talk about this? You know, yeah, it can be scary. I mean, it's like, who are you doing the work for? You know, where are you? You know, it's like, on the first day of class, I brought in some, I don't even know who it was, but like another, you know, black kid had been like killed like right on that day. And I brought in this poem about it, and like the kids went ballistic, like just like went crazy. Like it was just, you know, just a lot, you know? And I really didn't expect that. And I was like, oh no, should I not have brought it up? You know what I mean? And I thought, I don't know, I thought everyone was going to like intellectually kind of like discuss it and say how they were feeling. But, you know, there are a couple of people of color in there that like, it set off something that was just unbelievable for them. And then it's like, that's the work too. Do you know what I mean? Of like being able to stay present and not, you know, not like sort of like relegate like what, you know, because I didn't realize, I had to like question myself, because I was like, oh, you know, how much have I been incorporated into the system, because I expected this black man to just be like, you know, play the game, right? You know, play the game, just like, and he went off, you know, and it was like, yeah, and there has to be space for that. You know what I mean? And so it really kind of like challenged me in terms of my own beliefs and like, what have I, you know, what am I willing to do and what am I not willing to say and stuff like that? What have I silenced and what have I not? So I'm always challenging myself around that. I don't know if there are like answers, you know? You know, for people of color, like in academia and like a lot of, like I talk to a lot of students who have a really hard time expressing themselves and don't feel safe, you know, to talk about that, or they feel that like their lives are performative. You know, oh, I have to like talk about racism and then, you know, like spill my guts and like, and so a lot of times I'm talking to people of color and like saying, you know, forget all that, you got to do your work, you know, and what does your work want you to do? You know what I'm saying? And we have to take a lot of risks, you know what I mean? And it doesn't, you know, whatever people say or what, if something's helpful, then great, you know, and if something's not, then, you know, but like at the end of the day, also you have to answer to yourself. You know, you have to answer to your, you know, to your truths. I mean, some of us are negotiating like family stuff, like, you know, like a friend of mine is doing a visual show like about her family in a particular town, right? And like, and she's like, oh, I'm really scared, you know, do I do it? Do I not? Do I show it to them? You know, and I don't really have answers, you know, for that, because each case is like really different. Like I've said things about my family I was not prepared to say, you know what I mean? I'm like, ooh, and I got in big trouble for that. I was just like way too young, you know? And I wish somebody had told me, you know, had talked to me about it. So I don't really prescribe for people what they should say or what they should not say and all of that. I mean, you really have to, but I do prescribe that people take risks, you know what I mean? And that, yeah, and that you have to push yourself, you know, and who are you protecting, you know, and why? Yeah. Say again. Well, you know, I mean, I've been told that like people feel really safe in my classes, and I think I try to like start with like Audre Lorde all the way. I always start every class, no matter what I'm teaching. I always start with Audre Lorde, the transformation of silence into language and action. I always start with Dorothy Allison's Deciding to Live, right? So I feel like those kind of things like sort of set up the context of what we're working on, and it's usually artist survival, you know what I mean? And also real vulnerability, like, you know, artist vulnerability and stuff like that. So I think that makes people, you know, safe. And then we talk about, you know, not telling people's business or, you know, whatever, if we're in a class together, not talking about like what somebody wrote outside of the class, you know what I mean, without their permission, or so stuff like that. So we try to set up safe spaces, you know, and I think compassion in the classroom and all of that. But, you know, I mean, it was funny because like a friend of mine like called me the other day and was just sort of like, you know, she was in the art world and she had this like really bad experience with somebody, and she was like, I just don't feel safe. And I was like, I know you didn't call me and say you did not feel safe in the New York art world. I know this is not the conversation, right? You know, because I was like, I mean, that's fine for like Al-Anon and, you know, ACOA and like that we're all part of, you know, but it's like, you know, so in the classroom, I definitely think that there can be things that, you know, can be done, you know, that there is literature that sets a context, that you know, as a teacher, you set a context, you know, there are rules, you know, but I also think like, you know, going through like the art world, like you have to be like clear about what you expect, you know what I mean? So in classrooms, yes, right? But also a lot of times it comes from the top too, you know? So if in fact, you know, if it's like a really corporate place and they don't really care or whatever, and then you're trying to set up some safe space in that, like, you know what I mean? And like maybe they don't like value like Black professors or something like that, you know? It's like, it's gonna trickle down. So if you want like safe space, it has to kind of, it has to, you can create it in the classroom, but also it has to be on levels, it has to be layers, it has to be like a group effort. It's not just like in one place, you know? But that is a priority for me. And also like not judging, like I don't do, you know, bad or good kinds of things. Like I don't think that, you know, I don't judge writing by bad or good, you know? Like, it's more about like, have you said what you need to say? You know, have you described? How can you better it? How can you, you know, I don't know, how can you more articulate what you're trying to say? But it's not like, oh, this is a good piece of writing, this is a bad. So like taking those kinds of equations outside of art, you know? It's like, what can we do with it? You know?
Do we have time for one more?
Last one.
Pamela, I'm wondering in your work, I'm wondering how you find a balance between universal concepts and those which impact Black and LGBTQ plus groups.
Well, I mean, I feel like the more personal that you become, the more universal it is, right? So like no one ever told us that, right? That like, you know, like again, if you're talking about queer rights, you're talking about human rights, you know what I mean? Talking about everybody's rights. You're talking about, you know, Black, Latinx, you know, Asian, you know, indigenous rights. You're talking about human rights, you know. So there is no, I feel like if you go honestly to the work, that is like universal. There's no separation between, you know, like something that's really personal doesn't, you know, it's all part of the human spectrum. Yeah. So I don't say, I mean, you know, somebody was saying like, on Instagram, there was like Juneteenth, and they were like, you know, white people, even if this isn't a holiday for you, you know, you can like do the work around racism, anti-racist stuff. And I was just kind of like, what, you know, like Christmas, like all these things are like held as like these universal holidays. Why wouldn't Juneteenth like be a universal holiday, right? Slavery was part of America, you know, the freeing of like slaves who got the message late, you know, that they were free. Basically, that's the human experience, you know what I mean? That's the American experience. So, I mean, I was surprised that like somebody would say it wasn't a holiday for them. You know what I mean? I'm like, okay. You know, so I don't think like that. I think like you tell your truth, and like the closer that you come to your truth, the more you'll come to the universal. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly and Terry, again for your great introduction. Thank you, everyone, for your attention and for your great questions. And let's give Pamela one more healthy round of applause. Yeah. So just a reminder, Pamela's colloquium is tomorrow 5 to 8. I don't know where it is. Does someone know where it is? Sharp 327. So, you know, be there or be square. Some of you have to be there, but I would love to see everyone there. And let's colloque.